All right, let's dive into something that's, well, it's a powerful idea, and for a lot of folks, it can be a really tough one to wrestle with. We're going to talk about the concept of God not just as a creator, but as a sovereign designer, someone who intentionally creates unequally.
You know that phrase, right? We all know it. All men are created equal. It's kind of baked into our DNA, isn't it? It's the foundation for so much of how we think about fairness and justice and human worth. We just hear it and we nod.
But what if that's not exactly a biblical truth? That's the real question we're tackling today. Because, when you actually get into the texts themselves, things get way more complicated. The picture that starts to form, well, it really pushes back against how we usually think about equality.
Okay, so let's be super clear about what we're talking about here. This isn't about value, not at all. The idea is that every single person has the exact same infinite value in God's eyes. But, and this is the big but, we might not all be built from the same blueprint. The Bible seems to suggest we're actually created with some pretty big inequalities in our very design, and for a very specific reason.
So, let's look at our first case study. Picture this. We're on an ancient battlefield in a place called Gath. And we meet this guy who is definitely not your standard issue human being.
And listen to how the Bible describes him. It's not just, oh, he was a big guy. Nope. It gets super specific. It says he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. That's 24 digits in total. That's not just some random detail thrown in for flavor. It's a very pointed statement about how this person was physically constructed, a massive departure from what's normal. So what's the takeaway? Well, the big idea here is that God's creative toolbox is just huge. He's not working off some single boring template. From this viewpoint, these physical differences, whether it's having more, like this giant, or maybe even less than what we think of as average, they aren't mistakes. They're actually a showcase of a designer who loves variety. Okay, so that naturally leads us to the next level of this idea, right? It's one thing to have extra fingers, but what about when a physical difference is seen by everyone around you as a weakness, a flaw, even?
Let's talk about a guy named Ehud. Now, you gotta understand, back in the ancient world, being left-handed wasn't just a quirky trait. It was often seen as a real disadvantage. In fact, the original Hebrew language kind of suggests that his right hand was maybe even impaired or restricted somehow.
And pay attention to how the text is worded. It doesn't say God found a hero, and by the way, he was a lefty. No. It specifically highlights this trait, putting it front and center, and for good reason, because as you're about to see, it's the whole key to the story.
So get this. Ehud's left-handedness turns out to be his superpower. It's what allows him to hide his weapon on his right leg, a place nobody would think to check. The king's guards would have frisked his left side, the dominant side for a right-handed person. So the very thing that made him different, maybe even looked down on in his culture, that defect, becomes the secret weapon God uses to deliver an entire nation. How cool is that?
All right, our last case study. And I gotta say, this one is probably the most direct, and maybe the most challenging for us to hear, because it comes straight from Jesus. And it's about biological realities that people are just born with.
I mean, listen to this. Jesus straight up says that some people start life on a fundamentally different track. He talks about eunuchs who were born that way, born in a way that means a typical life path, with marriage and kids, just isn't in the cards for them.
And the implication here is it's huge. It's suggesting that God is the one who hands out different life paths, different biological makeups, different abilities right from the get-go. And the challenge, the call, is to take whatever design you've been given and use that specific design for the kingdom. So, you see the pattern, right? The giant, Ehud the left-hander, the eunuch from birth. These aren't just quirky, isolated stories. They're all pieces of a much bigger puzzle, a theological framework about God's purpose and his right to design things his way.
And this chart really sums it up nicely. You can see the progression. First, you have divine distinction. God just likes variety, like with the giant. Then you get the design of defect. What looks like a flaw, like with Ehud, is actually a feature. And finally, the distribution of destiny. People are given different biological setups from birth, like the eunuch. All 3 of these point back to one single sovereign designer.
And then comes the classic, you could call it the biblical mic drop on this whole topic. The potter and the clay. It's a powerful analogy, and the point is pretty blunt. Does the pot get to argue with the potter about why it was shaped a certain way? The answer is nope.
Okay, but wait a minute. This raises a massive question, doesn't it? If God is this sovereign designer, pulling all the strings, what about us? What about our choices, our free will? What about when we actively resist his plan? How can both of those things possibly be true at the same time?
So, to get our heads around this, we need a couple of key terms. The first one is boulima. Just think of boulima as God's master plan. The big, big picture. It's the ultimate goal that's going to happen, come hell or high water.
And then, on the other side, you have thelema, and that's us. That's human will. It's our desires, our choices, and this is the important part, our active resistance to what God wants.
So let's watch how these two things interact. God's boulema, his grand plan, was to put Jesus, who the Bible calls a stumbling stone, right in the middle of everything, to bring salvation to the world. And what was man's thelema, our human will? We actively stumbled over that stone. We resisted, we rejected him. So, you have both things happening at once, God's plan and human rebellion. How is that not a flat-out contradiction?
Well, this is where the analogy of the dam and the engineer really helps. It's brilliant. Okay, so imagine some guy decides he hates this river and he's going to stop it. He builds a huge dam. His intention, his thelema, is pure resistance. He wants to block the flow. And he's totally responsible for that choice. But what if there's a master engineer who's overseeing the whole valley? And this engineer knew the man would build the dam. In fact, he counted on it. He wanted the dam to be built right there because it was the perfect way to divert the water to a power plant that would light up a whole city.
You see how that works? It's the perfect picture of the resolution. The guy who built the dam, he's still at fault for his rebellious heart. His intent was wrong. But his resistance didn't derail the engineer's plan for a second. In fact, it was the very thing that accomplished it. And that's the theological argument. Our resistance, our thelema, gets woven into God's sovereign plan, his boulima, even while God never ever condones the rebellion itself.
And that leaves us with this final thought, a question to really chew on. It brings everything we've talked about, from giants with extra toes to left-handed heroes, right back to you and me. What if that thing about you, that thing you see as weird or as a limitation, or even as a flaw, what if that's not a bug, but a feature? What if it's the most important part of your design, the very thing the sovereign designer plans to use for his greatest purpose?